Is AI extending the mind? Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second annual Cross Labs Workshop Online, third day today. And this workshop is organized by Cross Labs, our interdisciplinary research institute located here in Kyoto, Japan, and supported by Cross Compass, leading AI company in Japan. We are here all week talking about AI and cognition, featuring speakers from all over the place that will help us think in orthogonal ways about how AI can extend our concepts of mind and intelligence. If you're joining us on YouTube, welcome, and be sure to subscribe to our channel if you want to get notifications about upcoming events, including our monthly Crossroads series. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce the two speakers we'll have. So Dobromir Dotov is a postdoctoral researcher at the Auditory Development Lab of the University of Connecticut, working on human and animal behavior, cognition, autonomy, many different topics of complex systems. And Tom Froese, who is an assistant professor at OIST here in Japan, in Okinawa, leads the Embodied Cognitive Science Unit and focuses on how agents are transformed by their interactions with each other. So we'll have first their talks for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have, like every day, 20 minutes for questions afterwards. We'll be taking the questions via Slido. We'll be posting the link. So whether you're joining us from Zoom or YouTube, you'll be able to participate. Just click on the link in the chat and ask or upvote questions that you are excited about. All right, without further ado, Tom, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Olaf, for this nice introduction to our fireside chat online today. Let me start sharing my screen. Desktop 2. All right, and full screen. There we go. All right, so the topic of this workshop is actually quite close to my heart. The question of what does technology do to us, in particular, the new forms of technology that are being developed nowadays. And so a lot of the times, there's a kind of like negative association with the change of skills associated with these technological developments. Are we becoming dumber? There's this, smartphone but dumb user kind of idea. And what we plan to do today is think a little bit differently about the relationship between this kinds of technology and our capacities. So I will try to open the general space about how to think about the complex interactions and what they do to us, by arguing that to some extent they enable us to do more with less. And I will kind of like zoom in from a broad evolutionary perspective to some of the things that we're working on in the unit, and then I will hand it over to Dobry to discuss some of the ideas we've been working on together in terms of more interactive AI. All right, so yes, as Olaf mentioned, I'm the head of the Embodied Cognitive Science unit at OIST, and one of our missions is to see what kind of experimental cognitive science can we do with concepts derived from embodied cognition research. And so, of course, the brain will still be playing a central role in everything that we do, but we basically want to contextualize the brain inside the body. So we're going to look at all the physiological systems, and then our bodies, in terms of specifically human cognition, are also situated in broader contexts of ecology, sociality, culture, and technology. And then we think basically that we need to consider all of these different factors when we want to understand what is the nature of mind. So here's the kind of like brief outline of what I will talk about in the next 15 minutes. These are the open questions as I see it for the extended mind. First of all, how does this relate to encephalization in general? How does the brain fit into this story? And how did the brain change during social and cultural and technological evolution? That's something that's really up in the air at the moment, as I will show you. And then what can we say about this in a more conceptual framework? Can we use something like AI, even agent-based modeling, to speak to some of these open questions? And then I will finish just to point to some of the experimental work that's just being set up in our unit, and just to give you an idea of what the kind of things that we're looking at. And I'd be very happy to also hear any kind of suggestions that you might have for things that would be interesting to investigate. All right, so let's get started. So in the 90s, there was a lot of excitement about the social brain hypothesis, which seemed to give a very nice unified explanation of why human brains, compared to body size, are so much bigger than in other animals. And here we have Dunbar's famous graph, where he shows that there's a positive relationship between group size and relative neocortex volume. And in particular, we find humans as the dot on the top. And if we draw like an imaginary line to the y-axis, we'll find that that gives us a number of 150, which is Dunbar's famous number for the natural group size that we should be, comfortable living with. Of course, nowadays we live in much bigger groups, and so there was a big UK project with working with anthropologists and archaeologists and neuroscientists, where they looked at the evolution of social life and how it shaped the human mind. So this is a really cool book. I love it. It's giving a really broad picture of human evolution, going from the genetics and the biology to the archaeology, and looking at the origins of the first symbolic practices and everything. So this is kind of like a summary of the social brain hypothesis. But in recent years, things have become more complicated. And they've become complicated both in terms of the data that's available, but also in terms of the conceptual framework in which we're interpreting the data. So first this, with the current data we have, there is no more evidence for the social brain hypothesis. So this recent paper says primate brain size is predicted by diet, but not by sociology. So when you group all the different data points we have about primates and you put in all the factors and you throw our best statistics at it, the only factor that stands out as significantly related with brain size is diet. Namely that those species of primates that have a more rich diet, especially in terms of fruits and so on, and who don't just eat leaves, well, they tend to have bigger brains. So that basically means that it's the metabolic constraints which is limiting brain size, but it's not really the sociality per se that's driving things. So that's kind of surprising, and we kind of need to digest that a little bit, right? It's really saying, wait, well, hang on a second. So what happened with all that nice data that I just showed you, right? So, but it seems like the picture is much more complicated, and the social factors are much more elusive here in this story. Even worse, when we look at humans specifically, and this has been known for some time, but has been kind of brushed under the carpet, it is the case that around the world, brain sizes have been decreasing steadily. And so here's this graph where we look at back at 40,000 years, and our brain size actually plateaued much earlier than this. But here is where we really start seeing this decreasing trend, which accelerates in the last few thousand years. So actually, our current brain size, puts us farther back into evolutionary time. We're no longer as big brained as we were not too long ago. So again, the question is, what's going on here? If we're becoming socially more and more complex and more interconnected, and our group sizes are exploding, and all of the ways in which we're connected is exploding, how come our brain size is decreasing? It might be suggested here that the people who think that our technology is making us dumber, maybe they have a point, right? Maybe this is actually showing evidence that we are becoming somehow less cognitively capable as our cultural evolution progresses. But there's a different way of thinking about it, already suggested in this article, but also more recently formulated in this nice paper here, where the author takes aim at the social brain hypothesis and says, the social brain hypothesis, the problem is that although it talks about the social, it's a very brain-centric, internalist style of thinking about what the brain actually does. And when we think about the brain as being part of our body and being part of a broader system of practices, social, cultural, and technological, well, then it's not so clear anymore how our prediction should go, right? So maybe it is the case that our brains can become smaller because they're being empowered by all the things that are happening around it, right? So in that case, we might expect that there's a decrease with brain size, the more it's possible for us to offload our cognitive capacities into a social technological environment. And actually, there are some nice data that speak to this, and we got it from social insects. So social insects, in this case wasps, but it's also true of others. If we look at the evolutionary transitions from solitary species, where we have a group size of 1, to colonies, so social ways of life, we basically find the inverse as the correlation that we saw in Dunbar's plot. There's a decrease in the relative, what would be the neocortex size compared to group size. So instead of having a social brain hypothesis, they propose distributed cognition as being the better way of thinking about the relationship between brain size and pro-social ways of life. All right, so that's the kind of like empirical picture. Like I said, it's very interesting at the moment because basically the things that have been taken as already accepted truth to some extent are now up for grabs again, and now new ways of thinking about the data are needed. So in that context, we started trying to play around with some agent-based modeling to see how to think about this. And so we have this little paper that came out recently, Shrunken Social Brains. So what conditions might lead to smaller brains actually being able to do more cognitive work? All right, let me just take you a little bit through this model. So it's a very simple thought experiment, right? There's no supposed to realism implied by this model. It's just supposed to give us a kind of intuition about how to think about these kinds of scenarios. So we have two different kinds of agents which differ in terms of their size. So basically, one is a 2-neuron system, one's a 3-neuron system. We just want to compare the differences between these degrees of freedom, small brain, big brain, just very simple. And we have two conditions. They can be either solitary or social, meaning dyadic in interaction. Okay, so those are the kind of like two factors that we can play against each other. We apply a simple evolutionary algorithm, which basically, in this case, didn't have a specific task, except that we're just asking the complexity of the neural dynamics in these brains to be as high as possible. So we're really just wanting to understand how much complexity is possible for these kinds of systems, depending on their size and depending on their social conditions. And out of interest, what would these kind of behaviors look like? What are the behaviors that would increase this kind of neural complexity? And so we evolved them, and what did we find? So here's the larger brain agent, right? The 3-neuron system evolved in isolation to maximize its neural entropy. Right, so basically what it does is it has these short, swirly movements interspersed with long trajectories. That's kind of interesting, right? So kind of like chaotic itinerancy evolving out of the system. And so just kind of like speed things up. Here's like the trajectory that it does over time. And then this is the neural activity of the 3 neurons. All right, so that gives us an idea of what the 3-neuron system is capable of. Now we do the same thing, and this is just sped up, so don't get confused by the speed, but now we do the same thing for the 2-neuron system, but we evolve it in an environment where there's another 2-neuron agent. And very nicely, what happens is they spontaneously start to interact with each other, even though we didn't specifically select for that. All we said is you need to have the most complicated neural complexity, right? So that's our optimization function. We didn't say you need to do it in interaction, but turns out that like one of the most easy solutions for artificial evolution is to take advantage of the fact that there's another agent in the environment and use that in order to boost neural entropy. And so if you look at this, well, you can see that compared to the previous agent, there's a lot more going on here. And so the interesting thing is that actually, although this is a smaller brain agent, it can generate more complex signatures than the larger brain agent because it's in the social condition compared to the other one's isolated condition. And because these are such simple systems, we can also look into their artificial brains and look at what's the structure like. What is it that actually evolved in these systems? So here's the state space analysis of the continuous time recurrent neural networks that evolved in these systems. And then the top left, we have the decoupled, so like isolated brain of the 3-neuron solitary agent when it was evolved in isolation. And it's a pretty complicated attractor landscape, right? So you have like a unstable node and a couple of saddle nodes, and somehow it kind of like swirls around in this space. If we were to do the same thing with just a 2-neuron system, so it didn't show you this data, but if you just take a 2-neuron system and evolve it in isolation too, the best it can do is actually spiral into this limit cycle or into this fixed point. because basically as a two-dimensional system, continuous system, it can't do any better than that. You know, if you want to get something chaotic, you have to have at least three dimensional continuous system. So, but what's going on with the two neuron system when we involve it in the interactive situation? That's what we see here at in plot C, where we now look at the social evolution agent. And interesting enough, actually turns out that its attractor landscape is simpler compared to when we were evolving that same agent in isolation, right? So there's just all these lines going almost in a linear way into a fixed point attractor. Now that's kind of surprising, right? Because if I showed you this and I asked you, what kind of attractor landscape do you think is generating this activity here, this new signature? Who would have said, oh, that must be a fixed point attractor? But it can't, right? Obviously, this can't be generated by a fixed point attractor. And yet when we open up the system and look inside the brain, what we find is a single fixed point attractor, right? And why? Well, it's because when the two systems interact with each other, most of the time, the system doesn't even enter this basin in that way. So this is what we're plotting here on the right. If we just take the trajectory that the agents were doing in the video I showed you, and I plot it on the same state space, you can see that actually the fixed point attractor is never reached, right? It's actually like moving around in this really strange pattern into the state space. So that basically shows us that we need to be very careful for making any kind of deductions about the complexity of the neural activity given a certain kind of size or structure of the brain. So for example, even though we've seen that the brain size decreased significantly over time, well, I mean, what does that mean, right? Maybe that actually doesn't say anything about our cognitive complexity, if we take this as an example. And just to show you that how important the social interaction is, if we now took this agent that was evolving with the other one, but just isolated it, well, then it can't do much. And as expected, in that case, the neural activity just falls into the fixed point attractor, right? So I mean, this is what, another point here would be, it's a kind of vulnerability, right? I mean, you really depend on the existence of a certain kind of environment in order to offload into them or interact with them in the right way in order to realize your capacities. And if that's not given, then suddenly you collapse into these kind of much simpler states. All right, so that's kind of like, opens up the space for thinking differently about what's the relationship between cognitive complexity, brain size, and our environmental interactions. And after our paper came out, it was cited by this interesting paper, which basically did a statistical reanalysis of this curve that I showed you, that all around the world, we see a decrease in brain size, relative brain size in populations around the world. And they pinpoint this as a relatively recent change. So yes, there was a slight decrease, but it really becomes only significant around 3,000 years ago. And they argue that this then is better interpreted as a kind of distributed cognition, just like the social insect example that I showed you, such that humans live in social groups in which multiple brains contribute to the emergence of collective intelligence. Now, this then becomes, almost like a nice empirical hypothesis that we can then look at. And that's part of what the work that we want to do. And so we have some proposals about how to think about the possibility of multiple brains becoming linked up in productive ways. And we have this review paper in the Neuroscience of Consciousness, where we basically show that the evidence right now about neural synchrony across people when they're interacting spans pretty much all the EEG frequency ranges. And there was some arguments by philosophers such as Andy Clark, famous proponent of the extended cognition framework, that maybe consciousness would not be extended because it's depending on high frequency neural activity. Well, according to this kind of data, maybe that's not even a problem. And we do also find neural synchrony across people, even in the high frequency registers. So there's again, this is a new field. There's lots of activity there. It's not really clear exactly what's going to be the solid, facts, because every study is a little bit different. So still a lot to be worked out there, but there's a very fascinating, intriguing thing to be studied. And it's not just epiphenomenal, apparently. It's not just correlational. Just to give one example, this made the news because it can't really do this in humans very well, but they had implanted electrodes into mouse brains and artificially induced more neural synchrony between the two mice. And in that case, they started cuddling with each other, bonding, and even though they were strangers, they spent all this time together. You can look it up online. There's like videos and so on where you can basically see them when they're zapping their brain, suddenly they start like cuddling and so on. So this is just to show that this is a very kind of like intrusive use of technology, but there might be uses of technology that, if they were to facilitate us to connect more easily using technology, for example, because they induce more interbrain synchrony, maybe it would actually facilitate pro-social behavior over social media, over technology, depending on how that kind of thing would be implemented. And so we want to also study that in our lab, and I'm gonna stop here soon. So we're setting up an EEG hyperscanning lab, and one of the things that we're going to look at is actually video chat, the way that we're doing it right now, to see if the people are engaging in face-to-face chat or video chat or voice chat. How does that change the way in which our brains are syncing up? Is it the case that we might expect that video chat reduces our capacity to sync up? Or maybe it actually has the opposite effect. Some people respond that they're disinhibited in online settings more so than in real life settings. And we can also think about that, we're much more limited in our degrees of freedom when we're in video chat. So maybe that actually has the consequence that we're more similar in terms of our neural activity too. So I'll leave it there. So this is just to kind of like open the space to think about how our brains can be extended and how technology comes into the picture. And now Dobry is going to take us a little bit more into the direction of where does AI fit into this picture.
Thank you, Tom. Let's now listen to part 2, Dobry.
Unmute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sounds good.
So yeah, let me continue with as little interaction as I can. I'm going to show you 2 examples of how we try to implement some of these ideas into small, let's say, more like case studies or little attempts to develop things that have some application and look like what other people would try to develop as AI. So the first was a little a device for learning an auditory motor skill, and in particular we wanted to achieve something that is known in the literature is desirable. That's to encourage variability. So there are all these reasons. I'm not going to go over the whole literature, but it's good when you practice a motor skill. Let's say after stroke, you want to relearn your sensory motor skills on the affected side, for example. Some amount of variability is useful for several reasons. And by the way, it's an interesting point to include here, given that the workshop is about AI. For those of you who have been reading or trying to do AI, machine learning, etc., one of the big desirables is generalization, right? But actually might instead shift a little bit the balance on just generating variability, because when it gets to sensory motor skill, generalization is not necessarily the most easy thing. Is not even sure if sensory motor skill generalizes very well. So the question becomes how to insert variability in sensory motor practice. There's a little bit of a cottage industry out there of people in different labs who try different ideas to take standard tasks and insert randomness, one kind of randomness and with different statistical properties to just push things a little bit. Our approach was slightly different. Instead, we just decided to use chaos as a so-called natural way of generating novelty. So the task is to learn this skill, and particularly in this case to control a chaotic system. So this illustrates the whole task. There's a participant holding a device that controls the pitch of a sound that they hear in the one channel. So basically they're playing an instrument that just changes the pitch in continuous time. On the other side, in the other channel, they hear the stimulus, which is generated by the computer. And the stimulus is driven by this chaotic system. Their task is to synchronize the two. So imagine you're playing music and you're the second violin. On your one side is the first violin. Your goal is to match the first violin. But the first violin is a little bit drunk, so they're making these unpredictable changes. So this becomes a difficult task. And finally, because we have this extra connection from the participants' movement, there's a signal fed into the chaotic generator of the stimulus. The participants are given the possibility to figure out how to control it. So there's an affordance for control. Just to make sense of what we're trying to do, I have to tell you very quickly how is it possible to control chaos. So imagine that's the phase space of a chaotic system, and it makes these interesting shapes, and as it winds about, it becomes difficult to follow and to predict. But within this complicated space, this complicated shape, there are actually so-called unstable periodic orbits. So if you write on that orbit, if you find it, it's actually periodic, so you can stay there, and now you have a perfectly predictable, repeatable pattern. The issue becomes you have to know it, and then if you have this control signal, so you're able to interact with your, in that case, stimulus, you can keep it on that trajectory so that you can keep it predictable and synchronize with it. Think of it a little bit as it's a typical thing in robotics to train all sorts of algorithms, to try different approaches to controlling the pole or a complex pole on a car. That's a classical problem. So that's what we're trying to make our participants to learn. Together, make sense of the data. You have different control conditions, either just a periodic stimulus or the chaotic but not interactive, and at the bottom the interactive chaotic stimulus. On the left side, these are the first trials, so not very good, and on the right side you have exemplary good trials. The first point is participants eventually figured out how to synchronize and thereby control the stimulus. You can see using these shapes in the lower right corners, they actually managed to stabilize the chaotic generator on a more or less periodic orbit. Another evidence that they were good at this is that when you follow the darker band here, they synchronize better and better along trials, so they learned this task to some extent. The variability of the stimulus, that's the chaotic stimulus, decreased, so they were another way of saying that participants figure out how to stabilize it. Also, through the transfer entropy in the right column, it tended to increase with trial. Again, evidence that participants were interacting more and more effectively with the stimulus. They weren't just figuring out some trick, they were really controlling it. And here's the interesting part. I had to rush through these slides just to get to the point which is relevant to Tom's earlier slides, is without telling our participants exactly how to do this task, we gave them the opportunity to discover different ways of doing it, which was afforded by this stimulus. So the whole point was that there are different ways that the tool, the little device, allows you to control it. So you have two kind of trials. The first one, which is in the middle of your screens, you see the oscillations of the stimulus, and on top you see the amplitudes and the periods of the stimulus. There's some variability, but they're relatively steady. So in this trial, participants found a so-called period 1 stable orbit. or I mean, it's unstable, but they stabilize it. And at the bottom, it's a different kind of pattern. It jumps up and down, up and down, up and down. So this is a period 2 trajectory, which is something that this particular chaotic system is capable of doing. And you could see this further by comparing how how these are distributed with respect to the scores that participants achieved. So going from the blue down to red, you get the distributions get wider and even by model. So that's both for the amplitude and for the period. So which shows, it's another way of showing to supporting this finding that we created a little piece of technology. Maybe you wouldn't call it exactly AI, but it's a little bit of a training technology that allows participants to discover different sensorimotor patterns that suit their abilities and allow them in this sense to achieve one of the desirable goals that people in this field want, which is to retrain sensorimotor skill with more variability and with more possibilities. Now, let me go to the next example. That's something that we're working on to prepare. We don't have data, but it's kind of cool. I thought I might want to show it to you. This is with my current supervisor and with an interesting company based here in Toronto that does a lot of interesting things that I think will be for exactly some of your range of interest. So what we're working on is a piano partner that you can jam along with to practice your skills. So this is an example of what participants see on the screen. The green will be the so-called AI. The green will be you playing, and after a few bars, you take turn and the AI starts playing. What we're doing here is we borrowed some openly accessible models. At least the ones that we used are two kinds, an autoencoder on LSTM from the Magenta project. These were trained on a large corpus of MIDI recordings of piano playing. So now the AI, which is something that sits on a server, but you can actually interact with through the browser, can try to mimic what you're playing, but also add some degree of improvisation, which is very difficult to explain just how much, but there are a bunch of parameters that we're testing. And now, here I think are some of the interesting questions we'll follow. We will do this either with the computer or we'll do it with two participants sitting side by side. It becomes a little bit like a sort of a Turing test, because we won't tell them, or we might have to tell them, but at the beginning we won't tell them whether they're playing with each other or with the so-called AI. And by the way, I was thinking I might actually let you try this. It's available. I can just give you the links, maybe not right now, but if you think it's a good idea, I'll just post them later. Try these things and tell me what you think. It works better if you have a real MIDI keyboard than just your laptop computer keyboard, but you can at least try them. Okay, so is this a musical Turing test? And I think this is where the Enactive AI approach is really becoming relevant, to be thinking more careful about how we want to define the terms, how we want to define the questions. So obviously it's not a new idea. This, you can see, this is from many years ago. The way it's defined is exactly the way people usually approach AI, as something that replaces and becomes indistinguishable from a human. But that's not what we're after. At least that's what I think we shouldn't be after. What we should be after is AI as something that enables different ways of performing, different ways of interacting with the environment, basically different things to do. And I'll support this with more historical examples. From now on, it's not studies or data, it's kind of the history of technology. The one example that I really like is, some of you might know about this, is how these two devices, it's a small drum machine and a small bass sequencer, triggered a revolution in music. So these are the things that, if you find a few good documentaries about that, changed, they defined whole styles, whole genres, but they didn't just change music, they changed the culture, they changed the way people went and the way they listen to music, the way they dance to music. What is interesting about that, I should say, actually, that's very important and relevant to the initial discussion. The way they were, one of the reasons why they were so impactful was because they allowed people who couldn't afford to become musicians in the traditional ways, either because they didn't have time or because they didn't have the resources, to become agents and to become leaders. So these were enablers. Like they didn't sound very good. They were not used for what they were initially intended to be used for, but they become enablers of something completely different, but no one had imagined. So the initial inventors of this, you can see them, did not think of these gadgets as the things that would define a new kind of culture, a new kind of music. They were just trying to design little supplements to musicians who didn't want to pay a bass player and a drum player at home or in the studio. So they just wanted, this would be much cheaper than session musicians. But it didn't work very well. Then other people came after that and like, hey, I can do these very interesting things with these machines. And then things took off in a completely different direction. So the point is, if we assume that human needs and skills and environment are fixed, sort of like when mainstream psychology generally thinks about it, obviously the inclusion of AI will lead to displacing human skill. So basically, either AI does the job or we do the job. Like it cannot be both. But, and that's why I think the enactive approach is particularly useful here, because at least for me, that's the theoretical approach that really shows me how human, and not just human, animal action in the environment leads to new things. So it's a creative process. We make our environments and we generate new niches, etc. So basically, if we assume that the ontology of being is an emergent thing, then we see how it is possible for AI, if it's taught the right way, to enable new forms of being in the world. Basically, you can say instead of artificial, it should be augmenting intelligence. And you can kind of see this. Another historical example, this is just to conclude, which these are slides that a slide that I stole from a colleague of mine. We've seen this all along in history, from the domestication of the horse, which completely changed how, well, that's what's argued, changed how people at that time thought, their cultures, the military strategies. What's very interesting, I didn't know, arguably gave origin to their languages. Because you have to think, what happened with the domestication of the horse is that suddenly you're not just walking out of your area where your people are and coming back the same day. You're riding far, far away for days and then coming back. And now you have to explain to them things that they cannot even imagine. Like they've never seen these new environments that you notice. So you have to carry all of this information in your head and then tell it to them and be able to convey all of this novelty for them. So this was a huge boost in language development, arguably. You can see the same thing, similar ideas for what happened with the invention of the train and the car. What's interesting about the car for me is it's not just faster. Obviously it's faster, but that's not the main point. It gave people a lot of independence. So it changed a lot about how people lived, how people think they could behave, and allow them to be more flexible even in ways that matter to politics, because if you don't fit somewhere, you just take your car, move to another city, move somewhere far away. So you don't need to be in good terms with everybody around you. Okay, in summary, basically this is the idea in how I think AI could extend cognition. Obviously, if you take a particular skill, the more AI you put in it, the less of a skill you need. But at the same time, with AI, you enable different kind of actions. So you can add another dimension. In this action space, now you have maybe decreasing individual skills, but you have more of them. If you rotate this space, you see how in the one case you have maybe a drop in skill, but in the other case you have lower but a larger range of skills. So you have more complexity here, which is in summary the argument, I suppose. And that's kind of in the cases one of the conditions that would allow me to say something about the main question of the workshop, which is AI can help. It is extending human mind, but if it's used, if it's designed the right way, basically, with the right principle in mind.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Dobry, and thank you, Tom, for your talks. So we have yeah, I think this is fascinating. Really, also in very practical ways, you can use these ideas to design different types of AIs that are dynamic and interacting, and also design interfaces, I guess, between humans and AI instead of what is it, like reverse engineering AI? You say that in your paper together. You can reverse engineer the reverse self-organize. You said something like that, which I really liked. So we have plenty of questions from people on Slido. So if you have more questions, feel free to post that on slido.com. The code is crosslabs, or post them in the chat and we'll try to pick them up. The first question would be about considering brain size and social interaction. So concerning simulation experiments, to what extent could other agents be replaced with environmental complexity? So I guess that's more for Tom, but I guess either of you could answer.
Yeah, I think it actually nicely spans both talks, this question.
Yeah, maybe so.
And it's a good question. We immediately asked ourselves that question too. And I should mention that also the work with Dobry came before this. So the things that we were working on in terms of the auditory chaos interface. In fact, we have a follow-up paper showing that there's not much difference if we just provide a sufficiently complex environment for the agents to interact with. So that then opens the question, what's different about that kind of system compared to a social situation? So, you know, when we have a piano or an auditory chaotic system with which we're interacting, yes, it can also increase the diversity and the complexity of our behaviors in a similar way as if we were interacting with a live agent. But I think that, you know, at first we were disappointed when we did the follow-up agent-based simulation, and we found that we couldn't really see a big difference between whether it was another agent or just a sufficiently complex environment. But it also got us thinking then more clearly, then what is it about the social in particular that could make a difference? And then there are things like actually like teacher-learner situations, and you know, things where maybe if you break the equality between the agents, it becomes more of an asymmetrical relationship or one more of complementarity and so on. Then in that case, maybe just having complexity per se is not going to be sufficient anymore. So, or as like Dobry's example, right? You know, like if I sit you on a horse and you go to a tribe that you've never seen before, you know, and then you tell them all the things that, you know, are in your lands. Well, it's not going to be easy to replace that kind of impact in terms of the complexity with just some you know, other kind of complexity. So there are some things about social interactions that I think push us into new spaces that maybe non-social interaction can't do in the same way. But I think it's an open question to exactly try to define where those boundaries are. Maybe Dobry, what do you think?
I mean, Yeah, I think we could maybe go to the next questions. I don't want to complete your
That's also
thoughts.
fine. Yeah.
Sure thing. So we have a question from Manuel, maybe this one. Yeah. What's the relation between, oopsie. All right. Well, that just happened. What's the relation between neural and behavioral complexity in the model? Were the CTRNN's weights evolved to maximize neural or behavioral complexity?
Yeah, good question. So no, it's just neural complexity.
So if I can add a little thing
Sure.
to that, like, because yeah, the space was a bit limited in there and it was also a bit noisy earlier. So were you also like evolving the weights to make the agent move? Or could there be a case where, you know, these agents were just, you know, making a lot of noise, but actually not like neural noise, but say not really moving?
It is definitely possible. Yeah. So I didn't give the full details of the simulation model, but they are acoustically coupled agents. So they, you know, it fits a little bit with Dobry's example. So they produce sound, continuous sound, and depending on how far they are from each other, you know, the sound attenuates over space, and they have two sound sensors, so they can hear directionally where the other agent is. But when we evolve them in isolation, for example, it's pretty much as if you're evolving a continuous time recurrent neural network by itself without a body, because their self-perception is constant, so to speak. You know, distance doesn't make a difference there. So it is really just like, you know, the inputs and outputs of the CTRN are fixed if they're in the isolated condition. And yeah, and it's important to emphasize again that we were just evolving on the internal neural complexity. We didn't, because if we did it on the behavior, we felt like we were going to build in that what we were looking for, right? We were really just wondering, if we don't bias it towards an interactive solution and we just force it to be very complex on the inside, you know, what's going to happen? And it seemed like this was the most easy strategy. That's not to say that it couldn't be possible also to have more, let's say, you know, solipsistic strategies that satisfy our fitness function. But, you know, I don't know how often that happens. You know, this could be someone else's, you know, project. If you want, do like 100,000 of these and then look at that space and say, out of this 100,000, how many of those are actually interactive solutions? How many of those are solipsistic? Maybe there are some surprises in there that very rarely something happens that we didn't see before. Yeah, and I should also add, which kind of goes into the more, you know, interface direction that Dobry was talking about. We're also thinking just to play with this with people, you know, like, because now we have EEG in our lab, and there are some students who want to kind of like have a real-time interface so that you can see your own complexity in real time of your own brain. And then the question is, if your task is increase that number on the screen, what would you do? Right? You know, start moving around, maybe start interacting with people, start talking. I don't know. So we can do exactly the same kind of experiment that we did with the artificial agents with people too, and also in social situations. We say, hey, you're doing EEG hyperscanning now. We don't give you any task. The only thing that you have to do and that you're going to be rewarded for is to increase these measures that we're showing to you on the screen here. And then let it up to them and say, what kind of behavioral space is the space that makes brains become more complex in their activity?
Right, and we have a next question from Alyssa, who is in the room.
Yeah, I was just wondering if either of you think about how agents or objects find new state spaces to operate in, especially as they're learning a task. I think one of the things that makes biology really interesting is that they evolve not just their own structure, but the structure of the environment so they can access new state spaces. I guess I'm just really curious to see what, you know, I guess like what your thoughts are about that, or if you have any ideas about it.
Dobry, you had the slide about opening new action spaces. So I think, you know, this one is for you.
Yeah, that's actually a very deep, very difficult question. It's about not just complexity, but when how do you enable the whole new dimensions of behavior? That's how I understand it. Yeah, so agents like simulated agents or human agents, or it doesn't matter?
Just any of them. Like, yeah, I think.
Yeah, I think that's when, for me, that's when the enactivist approach becomes really relevant, is because it's the only thing that tells me, or at least makes sense of animal behaviors intrinsically searching for novelty being driven by open-ended solutions to problems. And it's not even like, I'm always trying to avoid this whole thing. There's a problem and there's a solution. There's a problem, there's a solution. That's how psychology and a lot of psychology biology works. You're always driven by some kind of a predefined problem. Whereas in the enactivist approach, you're not always constrained by your initial problems. You just discover a new way of moving, a new way of generating, a new way of using energy, for example, a dimension that will allow you to absorb some kind of resource that this dimension of behavior hasn't even, is not something that you had been developed with. So at some point it became maybe even by accident available. So now that something becomes a new resource, so it becomes incorporated, and that's how I can make sense a little bit of that. But yeah,
I agree with that, and I think one important theoretical component to this story, and I think it's an unsolved problem, but are neutral spaces. So usually functionalist approaches, both in cognitive science and biology, are all about optimization. There's always something being optimized. And if that's your driving paradigm, then you don't have any conceptual space for thinking about what happens when there's no such pressure. But I think it's crucially important to have those gaps in the pressure in order to just drift for a moment into a different part of your mode of being or your state space or whatever it is. And then once your constraints start biting again and you have to start becoming into an optimizing mode again, you might find yourself in a completely different situation. But if you never give these kind of breaks or resets, then it becomes very hard to be able to switch into new domains, basically.
Cool, thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom. And the next question is from Fernando.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Dobry. Excellent talks. I have a question about the example of the 2x2 versus 1x3 neurons. If you have now one system with 4 neurons and you evolve it in the same way, do you think it would be more interesting than the 2x2? Or do you think there is something about a restriction of the 2x2 that makes the thing interesting?
Yeah, good point. I have a feeling that we looked at that. I'm trying to recall our result. So in general, I think you will find that it becomes less, prominent, the difference that we found. We kind of like set it up in such a way that because you can't get into chaotic dynamics when you have 2 neurons, the agents were kind of forced more into the interactive direction. But for me, that conceptually, I think it's still important to see that if we want to properly understand what a brain can do, we can't do that by just looking at its size or its structure in isolation. I think that point still holds. But then the question is, when we do have high dimensional brains and large brains, then in that case, how important is the interaction still? Can we carry our cultural world with us on a horse to another tribe, right, for example? But I think in those cases, then the question becomes slightly different. Like, how is it that if most of the time the evolutionary simplest strategy is to offload into your interactions, what are the forces that drive you into the opposite direction of being more internally determined? So rather than taking that as your default position, now that becomes the thing that we want to explain. And I think that's a kind of really cool study that could follow up from this kind of simple thought experiment and just ask, what are the conditions in which they actually rely more on internal mechanisms rather than interactive mechanisms? And something about the reliability of your environment will play a big role there. Like if your partner is sometimes there, sometimes not there, for example, well, in that case, you basically are better off with an internally based strategy.
Thank you. I think I want to ask you maybe a final question that is a bit more general, I guess, about how maybe the capacity can be reduced for either the human skill or the collaboration with another entity with respect to the social brain hypothesis, but maybe more generally to the more precisely to the mechanisms that you described in your talks. Does it enrich behaviors or suppress to a large extent the capacity that has been evolved before?
Yeah, this is speaks to this last slide that Dobry had. I wasn't quite sure if I completely agree with Dobry there, so maybe we can have a chat about that later.
Good.
But the skill really decreases or not. That's I think it depends a little bit again on where we draw the boundaries, right? Is skill something that is brain centric and doesn't involve the environment? In that case, we will be forced to conclude that skill decreases, the more our technology takes over the functionality or the activity that needs to be done in order to realize a certain activity. But if our skills are actually a property of the agent, environment, system, including the tools, well, then it's not so clear that, that if technology takes more of that space, that the skill is decreasing, So again, I don't know exactly how we would want to carve this up, but we have to be a little bit careful about our boundaries of how we're drawing the boundary of the base of our skill. And if that base actually includes the technology as a kind of interface that is part of what it means to realize this capacity, then I don't know, maybe then all we have is empowerment. Maybe then there's no reduction, really. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that if I ask you now to tell me, I'll ask you a mathematical problem, multiply.
No, please don't.
5 times 7, and raise your hand when you know the answer.
Okay.
So if I make you do basic math operations, I'm pretty sure that you won't be as good as you were before MATLAB.
Mm-hmm.
But with MATLAB, I can do math that I didn't even imagine I would be able to do. Mm-hmm. So I think these two are just both are true. It's just a multidimensional space. There's some measurable ways in which we're getting slower and worse. And
well, here's another way of putting it. I talked about vulnerabilities, right? When I had the social agent, but I deprived it of its partner, right? And suddenly it just collapsed into this catatonic state. So maybe our skills are increasing, but also our vulnerabilities for losing them are increasing. Mm-hmm. Such that, if I don't always have Mathematica in front of me, if I don't always have the calculator on my phone in front of me or something like that, then really I'm suddenly in a position where I find myself, less skilled. And so, so our vulnerabilities are definitely increasing at the same time as technology becomes more empowering. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. I think definitely theories from complex systems about how stable a solution is and how evolvable it is may help us. Maybe there is
that's true.
An intensive, extensive, no, that's the wrong term, maybe extensible, maybe in types of computing or maybe in the structure of the task space that may make it different. So if you consider the calculator example or Google Maps, people talk about that reduces your capacity to now map yourself with your own brain or body, and versus something like an abacus or some other tools that actually expand your capacity and they don't actually replace the capacity to compute. And the blind person's cane. Etc.
Yeah, that's a really cool example, Olaf, actually. And I think it goes also what Dobry said, that we have to think about how we design these systems to better make them empowering and interactive in the right way. And the Google Maps is an interesting one because some colleagues who are developing the field space belt, which is the Sensorimotor interface that you wear like a belt, but it always tells you where north is. If you train with that sufficiently, there are some indications that even once you remove it, actually, you have a completely different sense of space around you. You somehow connected things over distance that now my office is oriented this way and my home room is oriented the same way and things like that. So you start forming this meta space of how things are oriented with each other, and that somehow stays with you. So, but if you use Google Maps to find your way from your office to your house, maybe actually it has the opposite effect, that you kind of lose the sense of how things are connected with each other. So it really, but it's an open research question, I think. What is it about one kind of technology compared to another that brings us more into an open space where we can do more compared to a space where we do less?
That's right. And I think experiments that you presented, Dobry, are a very good step towards that. I think it demonstrates those abilities. Maybe we can continue this discussion. Thank you so much. So if you are following us on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us. And if you are on Zoom, please stay connected as we'll continue the discussion very soon. Don't forget to join also the next sessions tomorrow and the day after. Tomorrow we'll be talking about computational neurophenomenology with Keisuke Suzuki. So see you soon.